Welcome to Sleepy Histories. In tonight's video, I'll discuss the fall of Rome. We'll explore the reign of the last emperors, the distant rumble of barbarian fronts, and the final echoes of gladiator cheers. With every detail delivered in a calm, unhurried tone designed to soothe your mind. So, close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let the hushed cadence of ancient Roman tales carry you into peaceful slumber. The year was 476 CE, and the last Roman emperor in the West, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, sat trembling on a throne that had once commanded the known world. Outside the palace walls, Germanic chieftain Odoacer marshaled his forces, preparing to deliver what would become the final blow to an empire that had endured for over a millennium. The irony was not lost on those who witnessed this moment. The last emperor bore the name of Rome's legendary founder. Yet where Romulus had built a city destined for greatness, this Romulus would watch it crumble into the mists of history. But the fall of Rome was not the work of a single day, nor even a single century. It was a slow, inexorable decline that had been building like pressure in a volcano for generations, fed by a complex web of internal decay, external pressures, and the simple, brutal mathematics of empire. To understand how the greatest civilization the ancient world had ever known came to its knees, we must journey back through the centuries, tracing the hairline fractures that would eventually split the empire asunder. The Rome that began its descent was not the Rome of Caesar or Augustus. By the 3rd century CE, the empire had grown to impossible proportions, stretching from the foggy marshlands of Britain to the sun-baked deserts of Syria, from the Rhine's cold waters to the cataracts of the Nile. Managing such vastness required resources, manpower, and administrative capability that would challenge even modern states. The Roman system, brilliant as it was, had been designed for a city-state that controlled the Italian peninsula, not a continental empire that spanned 3 continents. The crisis began, as many crises do, with the best of intentions. The Antonine Plague, which swept through the empire from 165 to 180 CE, killed millions and devastated the military. Emperor Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king who should have been contemplating the nature of virtue in peaceful gardens, instead found himself fighting desperate wars along the Danube frontier. The plague had so weakened Roman forces that barbarian tribes, sensing opportunity like wolves scenting blood, pressed against the empire's borders with unprecedented boldness. Marcus Aurelius died in 180 CE, and with him died the Pax Romana, the Roman peace that had blessed the Mediterranean world for 2 centuries. His son Commodus, more interested in gladiatorial combat than governance, ushered in an era of instability that would define the next century. The year of the 5 emperors in 193 CE saw the imperial throne auctioned off to the highest bidder by the Praetorian Guard, a spectacle so degrading that it shocked even Rome's cynical citizens. What followed was the crisis of the 3rd century, 50 years of chaos that nearly destroyed the empire entirely. Between 235 and 284 CE, 50 emperors claimed the purple, and most died violent deaths. The empire fragmented into competing kingdoms, the Gallic Empire in the west, the Palmyrene Empire in the east, leaving only a rump state centered on Italy still calling itself Roman. Hyperinflation ravaged the economy as emperors debased the currency to pay their armies. Cities were abandoned, trade routes collapsed, and the very concept of Roman civilization seemed to be dissolving like salt in water. The military, once Rome's greatest strength, had become its greatest weakness. Roman legions, which had once been composed of citizen soldiers fighting for the glory of the Republic, were increasingly filled with barbarian foederati, foreign mercenaries fighting for pay rather than patriotism. These men had no stake in Roman culture or Roman values. They fought well enough, but their loyalty was to their commanders and their purses, not to the idea of Rome itself. The transformation of the Roman army reflected a deeper transformation in Roman society. The citizen-soldier ideal that had built the empire was dying, replaced by a professional military class that was often more foreign than Roman. By the late 3rd century, many of Rome's best generals were Germans, Goths, or other barbarians who had risen through the ranks. They brought with them their own customs, their own gods, and their own ideas about loyalty and honor. Emperor Diocletian, who came to power in 284 CE, recognized that the empire had grown too large and complex for any single ruler to manage effectively. His solution was radical. He divided the empire into 4 parts, each ruled by a separate emperor in what became known as the Tetrarchy. 2 senior emperors, called Augusti, would rule the eastern and western halves, while 2 junior emperors, called Caesars, would serve as their deputies and designated successors. The Tetrarchy brought temporary stability, but it also formalized the division that would eventually split Rome in 2. Diocletian established his capital in Nicomedia, in modern-day Turkey, effectively abandoning Rome itself as the center of imperial power. The city that had given its name to the empire became just another provincial town, its population dwindling as the imperial court moved east. Diocletian's reforms were extensive and often brutal. He imposed price controls to combat inflation, though these largely failed and drove commerce underground. He reorganized the military, separating civil and military commands to prevent ambitious generals from accumulating too much power. Most significantly, he launched the Great Persecution of Christians, the most systematic attempt to destroy the growing Christian church that the empire had yet seen. Yet even as Diocletian persecuted Christians, he could not ignore the religion's growing influence. Christianity had spread throughout the empire like wildfire, appealing particularly to the urban poor, slaves, and women who found little comfort in traditional Roman religion. The Christian message of universal salvation and divine love offered hope to people living in an increasingly harsh and uncertain world. The transformation of the empire became complete under Constantine the Great, who came to power after a civil war that destroyed the Tetrarchy. Constantine's conversion to Christianity, whether genuine or politically motivated remains debated, changed the course of Western civilization. At the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE, Constantine claimed to have seen a vision of the Christian cross with the words, "In this sign, conquer." His victory there made him master of the Western Empire and protector of the Christian faith. Constantine's establishment of Constantinople as a new Rome in 330 CE was perhaps the most significant event in the long process of Rome's fall. The new city, built on the site of ancient Byzantium, was designed to be everything that Rome was not: Christian rather than pagan, Eastern rather than Western, young rather than ancient. With its magnificent churches, its Greek-speaking population, and its position controlling the trade routes between Europe and Asia, Constantinople gradually supplanted Rome as the empire's true center. The division between East and West, initially administrative, became increasingly cultural and political. The Eastern Empire, centered on Constantinople, retained the wealth of Egypt and Syria, the trade routes to India and China, and the administrative traditions of the old Greek cities. The Western Empire, centered nominally on Rome but actually governed from Milan and later Ravenna, struggled with barbarian invasions, economic decline, and the enormous cost of defending its impossibly long frontiers. The barbarian invasions that would ultimately destroy the Western Empire were not sudden conquests, but gradual infiltrations that took place over several centuries. The Goths, Vandals, Franks, and other Germanic tribes were not savage hordes seeking to destroy Roman civilization. Many of them had lived on Rome's borders for generations, serving as federates, trading partners, and sometimes enemies. They knew Roman ways, often spoke Latin, and frequently converted to Christianity. What they wanted was not to destroy Rome, but to claim their share of its wealth and power. The Hunnic invasions of the late 4th century, set in motion a domino effect that would prove catastrophic for Rome. The Huns, nomadic warriors from the Asian steppes, pressed westward, driving Germanic tribes before them like a human avalanche. The Visigoths, fleeing Hunnic pressure, crossed the Danube in 376 CE and requested permission to settle in Roman territory. What should have been a manageable refugee crisis became a military disaster when corrupt Roman officials abused the Gothic refugees, driving them to revolt. The Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE was a catastrophe from which the Roman military never fully recovered. Emperor Valens was killed along with 2/3 of his army, including the flower of the Eastern Empire's military leadership. The Goths were now loose in the Balkans, no longer refugees seeking shelter, but conquerors claiming territory by right of victory. Theodosius IV, called the Great, managed to stabilize the situation temporarily through a combination of military action and diplomatic compromise. He granted the Goths federate status, allowing them to settle in the empire in exchange for military service. This solution seemed pragmatic at the time, but it established a dangerous precedent. Other barbarian groups would demand similar arrangements, gradually transforming the empire from within. Theodosius was also the emperor who made Christianity the official religion of the empire, banning pagan worship and closing the ancient temples. The old Roman gods, Jupiter, Mars, Minerva, who had watched over the empire's rise, were now forbidden, their temples converted to churches or left to crumble. This spiritual transformation was as significant as any military defeat, severing the connection between Rome and its ancestral traditions. When Theodosius died in 395 CE, he divided the empire between his two young sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west. This division, intended to be temporary, became permanent. The two halves of the empire increasingly went their separate ways, sometimes cooperating, but often competing, and occasionally fighting each other, even as barbarian enemies pressed at their borders. The early 5th century brought a succession of disasters that would have tested any empire at the height of its power. The Western Empire, however, was no longer at its height. It was ruled by child emperors dominated by Germanic generals who fought each other for control, while barbarian armies ravaged the provinces. Alaric the Visigoth had served Rome faithfully as a federate commander. But when the empire failed to pay his troops and honor its agreements, he turned against his former employers. His sack of Rome in 410 CE sent shockwaves throughout the ancient world. Rome, the Eternal City, the Caput Mundi, the capital of the world, had fallen to barbarian assault for the first time in 8 centuries. The psychological impact of Rome's fall was enormous. Saint Jerome, writing from his cell in Bethlehem, captured the horror felt throughout the empire. The city which had taken the whole world was itself taken. Yet even this catastrophe was not the end. Rome would be sacked again by the Vandals in 455 CE, and yet again by various other groups, each assault stripping away more of its wealth, population, and prestige. The Vandal conquest of North Africa in the 430s deprived the Western Empire of its richest provinces and most crucial grain supplies. Africa had been Rome's breadbasket, its vast estates producing the wheat that fed the city of Rome itself. Now those resources flowed to Vandal kings, who used their control of the Mediterranean to raid Roman coasts at will. Britain, which had been Roman for nearly 4 centuries, was abandoned to its fate as legions were withdrawn to defend more crucial frontiers. The Romano-British population found themselves defenseless against Saxon raids, and within a generation, Roman civilization in Britain had largely collapsed. The island that had produced emperors and poets became a battleground between Germanic tribes, its Roman cities abandoned and its Latin culture forgotten. Gaul, the wealthy province that had been Rome's first great conquest beyond Italy, was carved up among Frankish, Burgundian, and Visigothic kingdoms. These new rulers maintained some Roman forms. They minted coins bearing imperial portraits and issued laws in Latin. But the substance of Roman rule was gone. Local strongmen replaced imperial governors, Gothic warriors replaced Roman legions, and Germanic custom replaced Roman law. The Hunnic Empire under Attila presented perhaps the greatest external threat the Western Empire had ever faced. Attila, whom the Romans called the Scourge of God, had united the Hun Confederation and launched devastating raids into both halves of the empire. His invasion of Gaul in 451 CE was stopped only at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, where a coalition of Romans, Visigoths, and other barbarian tribes managed to force him to retreat. Attila's invasion of Italy the following year seemed certain to result in the sack of Rome, but Pope Leo III's famous meeting with the Hun king at Mantua somehow persuaded Attila to withdraw. Whether Leo's eloquence, Attila's superstition, or simply the Hun army's exhaustion and disease was responsible, Rome was spared. Attila's death in 453 CE removed the immediate threat, but it also freed the various Germanic tribes from Hunnic domination, allowing them to press even harder against Roman frontiers. The middle of the 5th century saw the Western Empire reduced to a shadow of its former self. Italy, Illyria, and parts of Gaul were all that remained under direct imperial control. And even these were increasingly dominated by Germanic generals, who ruled in the name of puppet emperors. The real power lay with men like Ricimer, a half-Vandal, half-Visigoth general who made and unmade emperors at will for 20 years. The economic foundation of the empire had crumbled along with its political structure. The complex monetary system that had facilitated trade across 3 continents had broken down. Cities that had thrived for centuries were abandoned as their populations fled to the countryside seeking safety. The roads that had bound the empire together fell into disrepair, cutting the arteries of commerce and communication. Agricultural production declined as farmers abandoned their fields in the face of constant warfare. The sophisticated villa system that had made the empire wealthy gave way to subsistence farming. Knowledge was lost as schools closed and libraries were destroyed. The literary culture that had produced Virgil and Ovid was replaced by an oral tradition that could barely preserve the memory of Rome's greatness. The transformation was not merely political or economic, but deeply cultural. Latin remained the language of administration and the church, but it was evolving into the vernacular languages that would become French, Spanish, and Italian. Roman law persisted, but it was increasingly supplemented or replaced by Germanic customs. Roman architecture survived, but new buildings reflected barbarian tastes and needs. Christianity provided some continuity in this chaos, but even the church was changing. The Christianity of the 5th century was very different from the religion that had emerged from the catacombs 2 centuries earlier. It had become institutionalized, hierarchical, and closely allied with political power. Bishops often functioned as civil administrators, and the Pope had become one of the most powerful figures in Italy. The Church also preserved much of classical learning, but it did so selectively, emphasizing those aspects of Roman culture that seemed compatible with Christian doctrine while allowing others to disappear. The result was a transformation of Roman civilization into something new, neither fully Roman nor fully barbarian, but a synthesis that would eventually become medieval European culture. The reign of Majorian, from 457 to 461 CE, represented the last serious attempt to restore the Western Empire. Majorian was a capable soldier and administrator who managed to stabilize the Italian peninsula and even launched an expedition to reconquer North Africa. His assassination by Ricimer in 461 CE ended the last hope of imperial recovery. After Majorian's death, the Western emperors were purely ceremonial figures, chosen and controlled by Germanic generals who saw no need to maintain the fiction of Roman rule indefinitely. The empire had become a kingdom in all but name, ruled by men who owed their positions to barbarian armies rather than Roman legitimacy. The final act began in 476 CE, when Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain serving as a Roman general, decided that the empire had outlived its usefulness. Rather than elevating another puppet emperor after deposing Romulus Augustulus, Odoacer simply sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople with a message that the West no longer needed its own emperor. He would rule Italy as a king, nominally subject to the Eastern emperor, but in practice completely independent. This act is traditionally marked as the end of the Western Roman Empire, though the reality was less dramatic than the symbolism suggests. For most people living in what had been Roman territory, Odoacer's coup changed very little. The same officials administered the same laws, the same taxes were collected by the same collectors, and the same bishops preached to the same congregations. The transformation had been so gradual that the final constitutional change was almost anticlimactic, yet the psychological impact was profound. Rome, which had seemed eternal, was no more. The city that had conquered the world had been conquered in turn, not by a superior civilization, but by the descendants of the barbarians it had once dismissed as primitive savages. The empire that had claimed to be universal and permanent had proved to be neither. The Eastern Empire, which would eventually be called the Byzantine Empire, survived for another 1,000 years, but it was recognizably different from its Western predecessor. Greek rather than Latin, Orthodox rather than Catholic, autocratic rather than administrative. It preserved the name and some of the traditions of Rome while developing along distinctly different lines. The question of why Rome fell has fascinated historians for centuries, and the answers are as complex as the empire itself. Some have blamed Christianity for weakening the martial virtues that had built the empire, but Christian emperors like Constantine and Theodosius were no less successful in warfare than their pagan predecessors. Others have pointed to economic decline, but the empire had survived economic crises before. Military historians have emphasized the barbarization of the army, and there is truth to this analysis. An empire that depends on foreign mercenaries for its defense is always vulnerable to their disloyalty or defection. When Roman armies became predominantly Germanic, they brought Germanic loyalties and Germanic ambitions that ultimately proved incompatible with Roman interests. Political historians have focused on the loss of civic virtue and the growth of despotism, arguing that the empire died when its citizens stopped caring about the common good. The transformation from republic to principate to dominate represented a steady erosion of the civic engagement that had made Rome great. By the 5th century, most people in the empire thought of themselves as subjects rather than citizens, and subjects have less reason to fight for their rulers than citizens have to fight for their country. Environmental historians have pointed to climate change, plague, and agricultural decline as underlying causes of imperial collapse. The late antique Little Ice Age may have made northern Europe less hospitable, driving Germanic tribes south in search of better farmland. The recurring plagues of the 3rd through 6th centuries certainly weakened the empire's population and economy. Deforestation and soil exhaustion may have reduced agricultural productivity throughout the Mediterranean. Economic historians have traced the decline to monetary inflation, excessive taxation, and the breakdown of trade networks. The empire's financial system was always precarious, dependent on constant expansion to provide the resources needed to pay the army and administration. When expansion stopped, the system became unsustainable. Heavy taxation drove productive citizens into poverty or flight, while inflation destroyed the value of money and savings. Social historians have emphasized the growing gap between rich and poor, the decline of the middle class, and the ruralization of society. The empire that had been built by citizen farmers and urban merchants was inherited by a hereditary aristocracy that scorned both farming and commerce. The result was a society increasingly divided between a small elite and a vast population of peasants, with little of the social mobility that had energized earlier Roman society. Cultural historians have pointed to the loss of Roman identity and the fragmentation of imperial culture. The empire that had successfully assimilated Gauls, Spaniards, and Africans failed to assimilate Germans, Huns, and other later arrivals. The result was not a unified Roman culture, but a collection of distinct ethnic and regional cultures that happened to share some common institutions. Religious historians have traced the transformation of Roman paganism into Christianity and the impact this had on imperial ideology and culture. The empire that had been built by men who believed in Roman destiny and Roman gods was inherited by men who believed in Christian salvation and Christian virtue. This was not necessarily a weakness, since Christian emperors could be as effective as pagan ones. But it did represent a fundamental change in the empire's character and purposes. The truth is probably that all of these factors contributed to Rome's decline, interacting with each other in complex ways that made recovery increasingly difficult. An empire facing any one of these challenges might have survived, but an empire facing all of them simultaneously was doomed to fail. The fall of Rome was not simply a military conquest or a political revolution, but a comprehensive transformation of civilization. The world of 500 CE was recognizably different from the world of 200 CE in almost every respect. Politically, economically, socially, culturally, and religiously. The empire that fell in 476 CE bore little resemblance to the empire that had conquered the Mediterranean 4 centuries earlier, yet Rome did not simply disappear. Its influence continued through law, language, architecture, and institutional forms. The Catholic Church preserved much of Roman administrative practice and intellectual tradition. The Holy Roman Empire claimed to be Rome's legitimate successor. The very word emperor comes from Caesar, and the concept of empire itself is Roman. The barbarian kingdoms that replaced Roman rule in the West adopted Roman titles, Roman administrative practices, and Roman law. They minted coins bearing imperial portraits and dated their documents by Roman consuls. They built churches in Roman style and educated their children in Roman schools. The synthesis of Roman and Germanic traditions that emerged from the empire's collapse would eventually become the foundation of medieval European civilization. The Byzantine Empire preserved the eastern half of the Roman world for another millennium, maintaining Roman law, Roman administration, and the Roman claim to universal rule. When Constantinople finally fell to the Turks in 1453 CE, it marked the end of an empire that had lasted for over 2,000 years, making it one of the longest-lived political institutions in human history. The Renaissance would later rediscover Roman literature, Roman art, and Roman political theory, using them as inspiration for a cultural and intellectual revolution that transformed Europe once again. The founding fathers of the American Republic studied Roman history and consciously modeled their new government on Roman precedents. Even today, democratic institutions around the world owe much to Roman legal and political traditions. The fall of Rome was therefore not an ending, but a transformation, not a death, but a metamorphosis. The empire that ruled the ancient world disappeared, but its legacy lived on in new forms, adapted to new circumstances and new needs. In law and language, in government and religion, in art and architecture, Rome's influence persisted long after the last emperor had abdicated and the last legion had marched away. The boy emperor Romulus Augustulus, who gave his name to the end of empire, disappeared into history after his deposition. Some sources suggest he was granted a pension and retired to a villa in Campania, living out his days as a private citizen in the countryside where Roman civilization had first taken root. It was a fitting end for the last representative of a power that had begun as a city-state of farmers and shepherds and had grown to rule the world. Standing in the ruins of the Roman Forum today, surrounded by the broken columns and crumbling arches of what was once the center of the world, it is easy to reflect on the transience of human achievement. The empire that seemed eternal lasted little more than a millennium in the West, a brief moment in the span of human history. Yet in that moment, it created a civilization whose influence continues to shape our world more than 15 centuries after its fall. The story of Rome's decline and fall is ultimately a human story, filled with courage and cowardice, wisdom and folly, triumph and tragedy. It reminds us that even the greatest civilizations are mortal, that power and glory are fleeting, and that the forces of change and decay are always at work beneath the surface of even the most stable societies. But it also reminds us that human achievement, while temporary, can be magnificent. The Rome that fell in 476 CE had given the world roads and aqueducts, law and literature, peace and prosperity on a scale never before achieved. Its collapse was a tragedy, but its existence was a triumph. In the end, perhaps that is the most fitting epitaph for the empire that ruled the world. Not that it fell, but that it rose, and in rising showed what human beings could accomplish when they dared to dream of greatness. The last emperor may have surrendered his crown, but Rome's true legacy could never be surrendered. It lives on in every courthouse where justice is dispensed according to law, in every parliament where representatives debate the common good, in every city where engineering and planning create livable communities, and in every school where students learn to read and write in languages that descended from Latin. The empire fell, but Rome endures, woven into the very fabric of Western civilization, and embedded in the dreams of all who seek to build something greater than themselves. The transformation of Roman society in its final centuries was perhaps nowhere more visible than in the daily lives of ordinary people. In the 2nd century CE, a merchant in Gaul could travel from the Rhine to the Euphrates using the same currency, protected by the same laws, and confident that Roman roads would carry him safely to his destination. By the 5th century, that same journey would have taken him through a patchwork of kingdoms, each with its own customs, currencies, and dangers. The great cities that had been the crown jewels of Roman civilization told the story of decline in stone and mortar. Trier, once the largest city north of the Alps and seat of the Western Emperor, saw its population shrink from perhaps 100,000 to fewer than 10,000. The magnificent baths, basilicas, and amphitheaters that had proclaimed Roman greatness were stripped of their marble and bronze, their materials recycled into crude fortifications or simple churches. The urban culture that had sustained Roman intellectual life withered, as the wealthy fled to fortified estates in the countryside. In Britain, the transformation was even more dramatic. The Romans had built a network of towns connected by excellent roads, introducing urban life to a previously tribal society. London, Bath, York, and dozens of other settlements had flourished as centres of trade and administration. When the legions departed, however, these cities were gradually abandoned. Archaeological evidence suggests that by 500 CE, grass was growing in the streets of Roman London, and the Forum that had once echoed with the voices of merchants and magistrates was silent and empty. The collapse of urban life had profound implications for learning and culture. The schools that had educated the sons of the provincial elite closed their doors. The libraries that had preserved centuries of accumulated knowledge were scattered or destroyed. The workshops that had produced fine pottery, jewelry, and metalwork fell silent. The very skills needed to maintain Roman engineering marvels like aqueducts and sewers were lost in many regions. Yet the picture was not uniformly bleak. In some areas, particularly in southern Gaul and northern Italy, Roman traditions persisted more successfully. The Visigothic kingdom centered on Toulouse maintained much of the Roman administrative system and even produced notable scholars like Sidonius Apollinaris. The Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy under Theodoric attempted to preserve Roman culture while accommodating Gothic customs, creating a unique synthesis that might have evolved into something new and vibrant had it been given time to mature. The role of individual personalities in shaping this transformation cannot be underestimated. Figures like Stilicho, the half-Vandal general who served as regent for the young Emperor Honorius, embodied the complexity of the age. Stilicho was fiercely loyal to Rome and fought desperately to preserve the empire. Yet he was also a product of the barbarization process that ultimately doomed it. His execution in 408 CE, ordered by the paranoid Honorius, removed one of the few men capable of holding the Western Empire together. Similarly, the career of Aetius, often called the last of the Romans, illustrated both the possibilities and limitations of the late empire. Aetius had grown up as a hostage among the Huns, learning their language and customs, and later used his connections to recruit Hun mercenaries for Roman service. His victory over Attila at the Catalaunian plains in 451 CE was achieved with an army that was predominantly barbarian, commanded by a Roman who was as much Hun as Roman. When Aetius was murdered by the Emperor Valentinian III in 454 CE, it marked the end of effective Roman resistance to barbarian encroachment. The transformation of warfare itself reflected the broader changes in Roman society. The disciplined legions that had conquered the Mediterranean had been replaced by loose federations of barbarian warbands, each fighting in its own style with its own weapons. The sophisticated siege engines and engineering techniques that had allowed Romans to capture any fortification were forgotten, replaced by simple tactics of intimidation and attrition. The professional officer corps that had provided continuity and expertise was supplanted by barbarian chieftains who owed their positions to personal charisma rather than technical competence. The economic implications of this military transformation were staggering. Roman armies had been expensive but efficient, capable of controlling large territories with relatively small forces. Barbarian armies were cheaper to maintain but required constant employment to prevent them from turning against their employers. The result was a vicious cycle of warfare that consumed resources without providing security, gradually impoverishing the territories that armies were supposed to protect. The religious transformation of the empire added another layer of complexity to the collapse. The Christianity that emerged triumphant from the conversion of Constantine was not the simple faith of the early martyrs, but a sophisticated theological system that had absorbed much of classical philosophy and Roman administrative practice. The bishops who replaced pagan priests often came from the same aristocratic families that had traditionally supplied Roman magistrates, bringing with them the same expectations of authority and deference. Yet Christianity also provided new forms of social organization that helped fill the vacuum left by the collapse of Roman institutions. Monasteries became centers of learning and economic activity, preserving not only religious texts, but also classical works of literature and science. The charitable activities of the Church provided a social safety net for the poor and displaced that the imperial government had never attempted to match. The emergence of the papacy as a major political force was both a symptom and a cause of imperial decline. When secular authority proved incapable of maintaining order, people naturally turned to religious leaders for guidance and protection. Pope Leo I's negotiation with Attila in 452 CE established a precedent for papal intervention in secular affairs that would shape European politics for centuries to come. The gradual shift from Latin to vernacular languages in daily life marked another irreversible change in the character of Roman civilization. While Latin remained the language of the church and administration, the spoken language of the common people was evolving into the Romance languages that would eventually become French, Spanish, Italian, and Romanian. This linguistic fragmentation both reflected and reinforced the political fragmentation of the empire. In the end, the fall of Rome was not so much an event as a process, not so much a destruction as a transformation. The empire that had unified the Mediterranean world for centuries was replaced by a collection of kingdoms that would eventually coalesce into the nations of medieval and modern Europe. The boy Emperor Romulus Augustulus, who gave his name to the end of empire, disappeared into history after his deposition. But the empire he represented had already been transformed beyond recognition. What ended in 476 CE was not the vital, expanding power that had conquered Gaul and Britain, but a hollow shell maintained by Germanic generals for their own purposes. Thus ended the Western Roman Empire, not with the clash of armies or the thunder of falling walls, but with the quiet resignation of a boy who had never asked to be emperor, and the pragmatic calculation of a barbarian general who saw no need to maintain an empty title. The sun set on Rome as it had risen, gradually and almost imperceptibly, marking the end of one age and the beginning of another in the long story of human civilization.